Hello, church history friends. My name's Barb Walden.
And I'm Seth Bryant, and we're excited to welcome you to our Stories of the Scattered Saints Fall 2022 lecture series.
Our Stories of the Scattered Saints lecture series is not only a great way to learn church history, it's also an opportunity to help support the preservation of Latter-day Saint heritage.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Barb. Donations that we receive during the lecture series will support the ongoing maintenance and preservation expenses of all 5 Community of Christ historic sites located in Kirtland, Ohio, Nauvoo and Plano, Illinois, Lamoni, Iowa, and Independence, Missouri.
So if you're interested in supporting the ongoing preservation efforts of these significant places of Latter-day Saint heritage, we'll drop the online donation link and mailing address into the chat for anyone who wishes to donate. Thank you, friends, for your continuing support of the historic sites. Now I'll turn things over to Seth to introduce our guest speaker and share with us a little bit about what's happening tonight.
Our guest historian tonight is Steven Bule. Professor Bule teaches art and architectural history at Utah Valley University. He authored the book From Calico Printer to Portrait Painter, Sutcliffe Maudsley, Nauvoo's Profilist, and curated 2 art exhibitions of Maudsley's art. His PhD from Ohio State University focuses on Italian Renaissance art. His published articles and professional presentations address sculpture, Matteo Civitale, and the art of the city of Lucca. He organized an international symposium on Italian sculpture that has met every 4 years since 1988. Following a teaching career of nearly 4 decades at BYU and UVU, Professor Bule is retiring at the end of this year. During his time at UVU, he served as Department Chair of Art and Design, as well as Associate Dean of the School of the Arts. In addition, he directed 17 study abroad programs to Italy, engaging over 300 university students in the study of art and architectural history. Welcome, Steven, and thank you for joining us this evening to share the story behind Nauvoo's famous artist, Sutcliffe Maudsley. The spotlight is all yours.
I'm grateful to have been invited to participate in this series. I'm grateful to Barbara and to Seth, especially the nice things that were said. And I look at these, well, for me, I look at this as a collaborative effort, because many of you know so much more than I do about the Nauvoo years and the experience. I'm looking at it from an art historian's point of view. So I really do welcome comments and feedback and help as we work together on these topics. There has been a well-known image, the profile of Joseph Smith, that's been known for a very long time. It's been popular through Community of Christ historical sites. LDS Church has used it on a series of publications, but students of the Latter-day Saint movement and its history often are not quite sure who the artist was. They know the image, but they don't know the artist. They don't know his name. And if they do know the name, they might not know a lot about Sutcliffe Maudsley. Sutcliffe Maudsley's story is a story shared by thousands of early immigrants, converts to the LDS Church, especially those in Great Britain, and individuals who left a life of difficulty, and with tremendous faith and courage, they left those harsh conditions and made their way to a brand new place, which is extraordinary. So Maudsley's story is typical, but he stands out because his images are key images of Latter-day Saint figures. In some cases, they're the only known images of some of those key figures. And in some cases, they're the earliest images that are known. And they go on to have a good legacy in terms of other artists borrowing Maudsley profile images. As an artist in Nauvoo, Maudsley played a key role that for the most part has been underevaluated. His paintings, I think, are the de facto official images of the Nauvoo experience with early LDS leaders. So his story is fascinating. It's representative of so many thousands in similar circumstances. And all of us who are interested in Latter-day Saint history and the early movement, we're all connected, I think, to this particular early painter. I have my comments divided up into three simple little sections. The first is looking at the life in England. The second will be a consideration of his life in Nauvoo and just a brief introduction to his art. And the third phase is the post-Nauvoo period. So comments will fall into that little category. Sutcliffe Maudsley's life in England coincides with the Industrial Revolution, and it brought great wealth to some, to countries and to individuals, but there was a huge toll on those who were already poor and the undereducated. A number of publications from the 19th century talk about the deplorable living and working conditions for millions of British families. The most vulnerable were children, who often were forced to work at home to help their families survive. In fact, there was a survey I had read of the late 1800s, around 1790 something, 143 cotton mills. And of the labor force in those cotton mills, 2/3 were children. There were laws passed establishing that children younger than 9 years of age were not allowed to work, but enforcing those laws was nearly impossible. And we know that children as young as 5 and 6 years of age could be found working in coal mines and textile factories, and in some cases up to 12 hours a day. These wretched conditions did not go unnoticed by British writers, including Charles Dickens, William Blake, and others. In fact, there's a poem by Blake in which he coins the phrase, "the dark satanic mills." Now, he used this for flour mills initially, but they were later, this phrase was later used to describe cotton mills and coal mines. This often bleak world was the world in which Sutcliffe Maudsley lived. Maudsley was born on May 9th, 1809 in Accrington, Lancashire, the first of 2 sons born to William Maudsley and Ellen Greenalch. They were a typical family for their time and for their place. For generations, we know the family was connected to the mills. We know that life was harsh, and we know that most of these families experienced extreme difficulties and poverty. The economy of Lancashire was driven by the many cotton mills in the area. There were plenty of low-paying jobs, common for family members, entire families, even the small children, to work in the mills, often in these really difficult conditions. Sutcliffe's father, William, died when Sutcliffe was only 3 years old. So a very fragile family situation was no doubt at this point made extreme. The father was a pattern drawer. We know that he was employed in local textile mills. Now, labor laws provided that children could begin factory work at 9 years of age. One of Maudsley's granddaughters later wrote, quote, that Sutcliffe never went to school a day in his life. He worked from 6 years of age to the time he left England, unquote. The Maudsleys moved about 12 miles south from Accrington to Toddington, probably due to the job situation, other mills, etc. When Sutcliffe's interest in drawing and art was first manifested, we don't know. But a granddaughter later, another granddaughter, wrote that his mother allowed him to be bound out to learn the artist's trade. Quote, in that day, it was custom to bind children out to learn a trade. So for 8 years, he studied art. He did patterns for materials, did carving and pictures, unquote. This term bound out is an interesting term, and it does not refer to a voluntary apprenticeship. British law typically identified a fatherless child, such as Sutcliffe, within the working and poorest classes as an orphan. And as such, the orphan child was ordered to be handed over to a master to raise and train in order to keep the child from becoming a public charge. This period of binding out usually meant being obligated to work until around 21 years of age in exchange for food, shelter, and some education. This very well may have been the situation of Sutcliffe Maudsley. The family situation without a father meant his mother most likely could not support him, and out of necessity, she had no option other than binding him out. For Sutcliffe, this meant working at a mill at a very early age and learning the trade of his father. Now, later on, we know that Sutcliffe became a foreman at a modest-sized textile mill. A foreman would have possessed a lot of needed skills and talents and a detailed understanding of the trade. In fact, publications summarize what skills were needed. To be a calico printer and a foreman, you had to understand the dyeing phase of the process, which included some knowledge of the chemical aspects. You had to be an artist. You had to have an eye for design. You had to be an engraver to transfer those designs to metal plates and then print them onto the calico. And you had to understand the mechanical or technical processes, which they called a mechanician. You had to know the processes for all of these different steps. So we can assume that Sutcliffe had the skills and had the talent. In fact, we have this surviving pattern, a beautiful design by Sutcliffe Maudsley, which on the back has written "to be engraved." It's a beautiful piece, perhaps for wallpaper or perhaps for something else, but it has a remarkable sense of sensitivity, light, delicate strokes that remind one a lot of how he handles the human figure later on. Parish records establish that Sutcliffe Maudsley and Elizabeth Foxcroft received a marriage license in June of 1830 and were married shortly after in Lancashire. 6 children were born to them between the years 1831 and 1840. The Maudsleys certainly were impacted by a severe economic depression in the mid-1830s. We know that employment and food prices were high and that wages had been reduced. One historian wrote, "A very large unemployed population was thrown out of work by the total or partial stoppage of the mills to an unusual extent. Power loom weavers stated that they were at this moment suffering under circumstances which were beyond human existence, perishing for lack of the necessities of life," unquote. Another historian stressed that the urban worker, finding himself in these dire circumstances, had very few outlets. One would be modest reform movements, the second was immigration, and the third identified was religion. So it's within this environment, this difficult environment, that Mormon evangelism became extremely successful. The first missionaries arrived in 1837. They spoke of a new heaven, a new earth, of brotherhood and equality, and of immigration to the kingdom of God, referred to as Zion. So this offer of a new life for body and spirit was immediately attractive to potential converts who were suffering in their circumstances. And Zion in America promised sanctuary from the difficulties and the poverty that was plaguing England. During the first 4 years, nearly 4,000 individuals were baptized into the church, and Preston in Lancashire became the church headquarters. Sutcliffe and Elizabeth were baptized in 1841 and were members of the small Toddington branch. In early 1842, Sutcliffe and his family left their home, their extended families, and the difficult life they lived with faith and hope in the message of a new beginning in a new land. In 1840, Brigham Young and other apostles met in Preston and announced the doctrine of the gathering, which basically is the belief that the heirs of the house of Israel were to gather in Zion, identified as Nauvoo, Illinois. The notion of gathering was a key doctrine preached at the time, and the Maudsleys certainly would have heard this in either Preston or Manchester, or probably heard it more than once. So at the same time of the gathering doctrine around 1840, the LDS British Mission, under the leadership of Parley P. Pratt and Joseph Fielding, began chartering ships to transport immigrants to America. For many, I would imagine this trip consumed whatever monies or savings they have. We know also that the trip could be difficult. It could be very dangerous, as recorded in a number of diaries. However, there is one interesting description written by a passenger that summarizes a very positive view. Quote, "I believed in the principle of the gathering and felt it my duty to go, although it was a severe trial to me in my feelings to leave my native land and the pleasing associations that I had formed there. But my heart was fixed. I knew in whom I had trusted, and with the fire of Israel's God burning in my bosom, I forsook my home." Unquote. The Maudsleys and other families from the Toddington branch sailed on a ship called Hope. The ship left Liverpool in February of 1842 with 270 passengers on board and arrived in New Orleans in April of 1842. After 57 days at sea, the immigrant saints immediately purchased passage on a steamboat heading up the Mississippi. Here's an example of the type of steamers that were available. There were two ships that were leaving the same day and arrived in Nauvoo the same day. One was called the Amaranth, the other is called the Louisa. They both arrived in Nauvoo on the same day. So between the time traveled from Liverpool to Nauvoo, it's a 69-day total trip. They arrived in Nauvoo in the spring of 1842. And the saints had been there for 3 or so years and had transformed this swampy area into an area of farming and commerce. And earlier, Joseph Smith had announced that a great temple would be built on the bluff overlooking the city below. So the Maudsleys arrived to find a city that was bustling with activity related to the construction of a number of wood and brick buildings, as well as work going on with the temple's foundation and basement. The transformation of this area on this bend of the Mississippi was a miracle, and the saints felt that they had finally found a permanent home following years of persecution in Ohio and Missouri. About this time, shortly after, actually, Heber Kimball stated that there were 1,200 buildings with several others under construction. And by the summer of 1845, the population of Nauvoo had grown to around 12,000, a remarkable growth in only a few years. So with the growth and prosperity, there were also many problems. The neatly restored structures that we see in beautiful Nauvoo today belie a city that was crowded with hundreds of shanties and crude one-story wood structures, cabins. Approximately 4,000 inhabitants, representing 1/3 of Nauvoo's population, were poor British immigrants like the Maudsleys. 1/3, remarkable. The realities of what was a harsh environment that presented struggles for the majority of these British immigrants was probably not unlike the difficult circumstances they had left. Often the homes, as they were called, had only one room, no windows or doors. The houses had quilts hanging across the front to provide some privacy and to keep out the Nauvoo flies, those ever-present insects that plagued the city in the summertime. Often the chimneys were no more than holes cut in the ceiling or wall with a funnel or a piece of tin twisted around to fit the hole to vent off at least some of the smoke from the cooking fires inside that space. These shanties would have been insufficient to protect against the harsh Illinois winters and against the unbearable heat and humidity of the summer. In the summer, there was infestation of these flies. There was outbreak of a type of malaria. This also made life extremely difficult. This is the situation then in which the Maudsleys lived. Sometime between January and March of 1843, Joseph Smith spoke to a gathering of young men and women in Nauvoo regarding the formation of a charitable society. And in the minutes of one of the meetings, Joseph Smith presented a petition from an English brother by the name of Maudsley, who was lame. He wished them to build a house so that he and his family might have something permanent among the saints. Maudsley had gathered a few materials for the purpose, but he was unable to use them. And Joseph advised this committee to collect funds for the purpose and to perform the charitable work as soon as the weather became stable. Family diaries and recollections later are clear in indicating Sutcliffe's particular fondness and love for Joseph Smith and the Smith family. We know that initially they lived 2 doors down from the prophet, at least that's the family recollection. Most likely this was probably a very simple shanty or a very simple rented room. Nauvoo tax records in 1843-44 show that the Maudsley family resided in a very poor and swampy section of town on the east side, about 1 mile from the Smith home on what was identified as Munson lands. And this may have been where the house was built that Joseph had approached the committee regarding. 3 additional children were born to Sutcliffe and Elizabeth in Nauvoo. 2 of these children died soon after birth, and a 3rd child, who was born in England, also died in Nauvoo. It's not known exactly of what cause, but the effects of the bitter, damp, cold winters, the poor living conditions, all of this may have contributed to the deaths of the 3 children. So these harsh realities of life and death, it's not unique to the Maudsleys, and it's not unique to Nauvoo. Infant mortality was quite high during this period across the United States, but Nauvoo's infant mortality of 65% was much higher than the national average. So the sufferings of many of these saints was significant. Some of the immigrants were disillusioned by the harsh conditions and either defected from the church and or moved back to England. But there certainly was a positive sense of unity within many of the saints in Nauvoo. In June of 1842, Joseph Smith recorded that sat for a drawing of my profile to be placed on a lithograph of the map of the city of Nauvoo. This was about 2.5 months after the Maudsleys arrived in Nauvoo. Shortly later, Willard Richards traveled to New York with the profile and with the materials for the production of the map. The copies of the map, however, didn't arrive until about 2 years later in 1844. Brigham Young advertised them for sale. A framed image was about $1.50, an unframed map was for 50 cents. It did become a very popular item. Included in the map in the lower left-hand corner is the image of Joseph by Sutcliffe Maudsley. And also included in the upper left-hand corner of the map is a reference to the temple, although it bears little resemblance to the temple that was actually built. The engraved image then is this sort of iconic image by Sutcliffe. The profile of Lieutenant General Joseph Smith in Nauvoo Legion uniform measures a little more than 8 inches by 5 inches. It's a very small, typically small Maudsley watercolor. Though damaged, the colors retain much of their original brilliance. Studies related to the uniform worn by Joseph inform us that Illinois law required military officers to wear a blue coat and white pantaloons, consistent with the regular U.S. Army military uniform. Joseph wears a white shirt under the dress coat, gold epaulets on the shoulders, a black belt, and a decorative sash. The red sash was an indication that the individual was affiliated with the artillery. Another reference to artillery is the insignia on the upper arm. You can see it just below the epaulets. It's been identified as flames shooting out of a cannon. Joseph wears, or he has there on top of the table, a chapeau. That's a French-style military hat with an ostrich plume. The 5 pointed stars on the hat are details typical of the highest ranking military office in the United States. A second image of Lieutenant General Joseph Smith is slightly larger. It measures 12 inches by 7.5 inches. Both paintings include delicate lines to create the eyes, the nose, and mouth. It's likely the image on the left was the image for subsequent images of Joseph. It would have been very easy and cheap to copy and slightly modify as needed, especially in the body from the earlier image. Joseph sat, that's the verb he uses, and I think that should be taken literally. The body could have been added later. Joseph's body in these profiles may appear to be a bit compacted or portly. Descriptions of Joseph, in fact, suggest that he was 6 feet tall, weighed 200 pounds, indicate that he was broad in the chest and in the shoulders and had an athletic build. So maybe Maudsley has captured some of that aspect of the upper body strength of Joseph, but the image still appears perhaps to be just a little bit condensed. In September of that same year, 1842, Joseph recorded that he sat for a portrait by a brother Rogers, referring to David Rogers, it seems. In fact, he sat several times for the portrait. Now, these were done in oil, and there's some debate as to exactly what portraits Joseph is referring to. These 2 oil portraits are in Salt Lake City at the Church Museum. But again, there's a lot of discussion, and many of you know quite a bit about that discussion regarding these images. Regardless, the image on the left is very, very similar to the Maudsley image. Either the artist on the left did his own silhouette profile of Joseph, or he relied very heavily on the image by Maudsley. Family recollections claim that the work on the left was by Sutcliffe. It was in the family beginning in the 1850s and hung in the home of Henry James. That was Sutcliffe's son, who was the only of the children to come with Brigham Young to come out west. And this would have been in southern Utah, where Henry James Maudsley lived. They were loaned to the LDS Church in 1920, but there's a lot to sort out regarding the authorship. But I think the Maudsley is certainly the important image that is going to be used over and over again for several decades by painters. So part of the question here is, what did Joseph Smith look like? And this is a complicated topic. The complicated topic resurfaced about 5 months ago with another work of art suggested to be that of Joseph, the one on the lower left-hand corner with this pastiche that I've created here. But rarely are the Maudsley profiles of Joseph mentioned, or they're mentioned in a very sort of quick way. Analyses and comparisons, especially with the mask, the death mask of Joseph, have led people to argue that the Maudsleys are in fact very accurate profiles. But they are profiles. It's a simple silhouette, and they certainly would be accurate as silhouettes or profiles, but it is flat and the minimal features are added by hand. There is no sense of depth. And of course, they reveal very little, the profiles. They reveal very little of the face when we are to consider the face by moving in a 3/4 or frontal pose. It's a complicated topic, but with all of the complications over the decades of purported images of Joseph and very romanticized images of Joseph, which don't always work well for me, this is the image that I always go back to. To me, this is the sort of iconic Maudsley image of Joseph that, even with all the debate about what Joseph looked like, I love to come back to this image. I feel safe with this image. Maudsley's art is typical for this period among artists who are considered folk artists or plain painters. Works by British and American contemporaries, I think, are important to consider. And in my view, when we compare the Maudsleys with these, his images are often far more sophisticated and far more interesting. Analyzing his works of art within this broader 19th century American folk art tradition, I think, is badly needed. His profile heads have been shown to be accurate. The lower bodies of the full-length figures, however, seem to lack the same accuracy. In some cases, the body pose or the stance, the shoes, the placement of hands, especially when they're holding an object, the perspective, general proportions are not always convincing. And this is fairly common, not only with Maudsley, but with plain painters or folk artists in general. I think in this way, he's typical, but the emphasis I think we should remember is with Maudsley's remarkable facial profiles and the details of the face. They're beautiful. An inventory of paintings that hung in the celestial room of the Nauvoo temple, I believe done by William Clayton, identifies 22 framed paintings. And I believe all of these are described as being in oil. And among these are images of Hiram, Brigham Young, and many others. None of the works of art are identified as being by Maudsley, and conspicuously missing is a portrait of Joseph Smith. Emma had in her possession 2 oil paintings of her and of Joseph. But given the issues between Emma and Brigham Young, either she didn't lend the portrait of Joseph to the temple, or she was never asked. We do know, however, that the Nauvoo map did hang in the temple, on the west wall, I believe, of the celestial room. This map, of course, it includes the only image then of Joseph that hung with all of the others. And of course, it's based on the original by Maudsley. A companion piece to the image of Joseph is the profile of Emma Hale Smith. Emma's clothing has been identified as a dark riding dress, likely one she wore when riding with her husband, as he reviewed the Nauvoo Legion's troops. She wears a ring on her 3rd finger, as he does. In her left hand, she holds a golden bird-headed riding whip, the handle of which is in the possession of a descendant, I believe. As in the painting of Joseph, there is a hat placed on the table. The black hat with a lace-like veil sits atop a brown table, whose perspective is, as in other Maudsley works, not always accurately rendered. A very important double portrait is this work of Joseph and his brother Hiram. This piece measures 13 inches by 10. On the lower left, it's indicated the authorship by S. Maudsley. An engraved image located in the archives of Community of Christ was created by Moses Martin in London. In 1847, This image was also widely copied based on the earlier Maudsley, and this double portrait combination was extremely popular with saints in Nauvoo, Europe, and of course later in Salt Lake City. Two other variations, well, there's a number of them, include these images here. Two images identical in size are among the more well-known profiles of Joseph. On the left is in the Archives of Community of Christ, that is ink on paper with very beautiful, delicate contour lines. This once hung in the Mansion House in Nauvoo and eventually passed on to Alexander Hale Smith. On the right is a lithographic print. Desdemona Fulmer Smith gave this work to the LDS Church and stated that she saw this portrait taken in Nauvoo while Joseph was standing and wearing a white broadcloth suit that she had made for him. Standing is another interesting verb here. He was standing. It has some of the typical inaccuracies of lower full-length images. And it certainly is reminiscent of the image Sutcliffe did of Joseph Smith as Lieutenant General. The print likely was made by Robert Campbell. It's based on the Maudsley, obviously. Somebody, either Maudsley or Campbell, would have transferred the line drawing onto the printing stone or plate by means of a simple device. Full-length or half-length images consisting of simple contour lines were extremely popular. Images of Joseph Smith, of course, would have been quite popular after their deaths in 1844. There are a number of these variations. These two half-length profiles may have been done after their deaths. They're very small, 5 inches by a little bit more than 3 inches, and both bear the signature at the bottom, by S. Maudsley, Nauvoo, 1844. Joseph Smith holds open the Bible. Joseph Smith holds open the Doctrine and Covenants. The Bible may refer to the translation Joseph was working on at the time. The Doctrine and Covenants is open prominently to section 80. Depending on which edition of the book this is, section 80 could refer to the Word of Wisdom Revelation of 1835, that particular edition, or to the fall 1844 edition, which is regarding Frederick G. Williams' calling as a counselor to Joseph. While these faces are in true profile, there's a slight twist that angles the chest and the waist area, revealing vest buttons, folds, and other details that a true profile would not reveal. The facial features, Joseph's collar, vest, and cravat are almost identical in other images that Maudsley did of Joseph. There's a very slight hint of flesh tone in the face and the hands. A nice detail, I think, is how both books go beyond what would have been the margin or the frame of the image. To my mind, the most ambitious work is this image of Lucy Mack Smith. It measures 12 inches by 7.5 inches and is watercolor or gouache on paper. Mother Smith was a remarkable woman, a key figure in the LDS movement. She was a powerful voice and supporter of Joseph and Hiram and was highly respected in the community. The Maudsley image of Mother Smith shows her seated in a blue and brown rocking chair, facing a window, and much of the window is covered by a fringed curtain. A fold of the same curtain can be found in the upper right. Her rather long right leg rests on a short footstool, while the left leg barely touches the floor. She wears a light blue necklace and holds a white and light blue handkerchief in her left hand. There are extremely fine and precise details underneath the transparent headpiece that reveal hair and ear beneath. There are also fine lines on the face, defining the wrinkles of an elderly woman. She would have been around 66 years of age here. She holds a copy of the Book of Mormon in her right hand, and on the rear wall, placed high up, is a framed image of facsimile 1 from the Book of Abraham. The work is, I think, very refined in tonalities and details, and the composition is among Maudsley's most successful, in my view. The perspective of the rocking chair and the convincing manner in which Lucy sits in the chair, except for the legs perhaps, contrast with the often awkward way in which he renders objects in space in his other works. It was suggested this image is that of Lucy Mack Smith that hung in the celestial room of the temple, along with the other paintings I referred to earlier. However, we know that this was not the case. The working method or the technique used by Maudsley to create his simple profiles is not known at this time. The only reference I'm aware of as to how the images were created comes from an article of 1910 in the Salt Lake Deseret News. It refers to a profile, an image of George A. Smith that Maudsley created 5 decades earlier in Nauvoo. The accompanying, and I'll quote it here, quote, "The accompanying quaint old picture of the father of President John Henry Smith is reproduced from a painting made in Nauvoo by an artist named Maudsley. The subject stood against a wall while the artist made the preliminary sketch by the process of following the features and contour of the body with a stick, at the end of which was fastened a pencil. From this rough outline, Maudsley made a smaller picture," unquote. Now, this doesn't seem to be very informative, or perhaps it is. The word "stood," again, is the key word. Beginning in the last decades of the 1700s, devices or tools to make silhouettes and profiles were known in France and England, and before 1800 also in America. And many of these devices became more and more elaborate and sophisticated. Given Maudsley's presumed financial difficulties, he may have only had a very simple, rudimentary instrument for the upper body, for the profile, and then would fill in the facial clothing, the details, other details as needed. A device something like this comes to mind, but I imagine what Maudsley had may have been even more simple. The extended line, or the extended arm that you see here, would have been used to trace the profile. And then at the other end was a pencil that would reproduce the same image on a small scale. The artist would then add in details as needed. There's no question also that a device, something like a pantograph, could also have been used, and most likely was used. But exactly what was used by Maudsley, we don't know yet. There was also competition in Nauvoo that I've been thinking about lately. Lucian Foster, a convert to the church and branch president in New York between 1841 and 1844, arrives in Nauvoo of April 1844 and brings with him the notion of the daguerreotype, this forerunner to photography. And we know that in August 1844, he set up a daguerreotype studio on Fulton Street. He advertised in the Nauvoo Neighbor, quote, "could produce an image of the person as exact as that formed by the mirror transferred to and permanently fixed upon a highly polished silver through the agency of an optical instrument," unquote. So he had a device that could produce an accurate image, well beyond a simple line drawing. In addition, in early 1845, 2 accomplished painters had moved to Nauvoo, William Major and C.O. Van Sickle, also converts to the church. In June 1845, these 2 painters formed an association, and they also advertised their skills in the Nauvoo Neighbor as portrait painters. The artists were soon quite busy with commissions for portraits, some of which hung in the celestial room. And I think that the arrival of two professional artists and an early photographer may have made it difficult for Maudsley. There was perhaps no longer a market for his artistic talents. Maudsley's images were limited to very simple watercolor images that were quite fragile. In contrast, Major and Van Sickle were able to offer more sophisticated images in oil. There are approximately 40 Maudsley's works that I'm aware of, and John Hyasek has an impressive collection of several Maudsleys. I have no doubt that there's a good possibility that there are others out there. Family stories tell of Maudsley works once in their possession that were subsequently lost. The majority of images that I'm aware of all seem to date to a 4-year window of 1842 to 1846. With the death of Joseph Smith in 1844, Nauvoo and the church, of course, were thrown into considerable turmoil. Threats from enemies on the outside, plus fractures among the saints on the inside over the question of succession, no doubt took a heavy toll. When Brigham Young took a large number of saints westward in 1846, those who rejected his leadership remained in Nauvoo for a time before splitting off into smaller groups depending on who they chose to follow as the leader of the movement. The issue of succession was very nicely summarized in this presentation of October 13. And I recommend all of you to take a look at that recording. There's a lot of good information that kind of clarifies the complicated sort of exodus out of Nauvoo. Among those who did not go west was Sutcliffe Maudsley and his family, with the exception of one son. They went north to Milwaukee. Where the Maudsleys found themselves in all of the confusion regarding succession is not known, but I see 3 possible reasons why they didn't go west. Number one, moving west would have been a significant financial burden on a very large family that was already no doubt struggling. It may have been impossible for a family of that size to properly outfit themselves. Number two, Sutcliffe's health was such that a long trip would have been dangerous. Remember that he was earlier referred to as being lame, and we also know that he suffered from severe asthma. So the physical strain would have been probably too much. The third cause, or the third reason, I think is the primary reason why they didn't move west, and that was the family's love and support of Joseph and the Smith family. A granddaughter's journal later reads, quote, "After the martyrdom of Joseph and Hiram Smith, Sutcliffe and Elizabeth joined the Josephite Church because of their belief that the honor of the presidency should descend from father to son," unquote. Of course, that took place a few decades later, but nevertheless, it makes the point of Sutcliffe's closeness to the prophet Joseph. As others, Maudsley may have been attracted to James Strang, who had started an LDS community in southern Wisconsin earlier, and he claimed to be the rightful heir of Joseph. Maudsley, in fact, had paid $2 for a subscription to Strang's Gospel Herald. That doesn't necessarily prove much, but it is an interesting detail. A number of prominent church leaders and even members of the Smith family accepted Strang's claims to be Joseph's successor. However, many distanced themselves from Strang over the issue of polygamy. But why Milwaukee? Were there friends from Nauvoo they traveled with? Were there friends from England already in Milwaukee? If they were attracted to James Strang, why not move closer to the area of Burlington? Was there work in Milwaukee? 2 children were born during the 4 years the Maudsleys spent in Wisconsin. What did they do? What did they do for a living? We simply don't know. However, in 1850, the census indicates that Sutcliffe was a painter, which is interesting. And we need to follow up on that. I'm not aware of any works of art produced in the 4-year period, but the label painter is an interesting one. In 1850, the family moved to Maquoketa, Iowa, in the eastern part of the state. Their last child was born in Iowa in 1852, although again, I'm not aware of anything related to his artistic activities after Nauvoo. It's difficult to believe that he ceased painting, but perhaps there was no market for his art where he lived. Perhaps photography had replaced painting and was very common at the time. We know that the financial situation of the family had improved, so doing works of art for needed income may not have been important. But it's also his health. Maybe that did not allow him to really paint much. In a later census, in fact, he was listed as an invalid. In the 1856 Iowa census, he was listed as a gardener, he and his wife selling flowers locally. In 1862, the Maudsleys joined the reorganized church. There was a small branch nearby, and we know that church elders often preached in the Maudsley home. Sutcliffe Maudsley died of asthma on November 29th, 1881. One obituary tells of the extreme pain he endured because of his asthma, and less than 6 months later, Elizabeth died, and they're both buried together in the family plot in Maquoketa. So as I look at Maudsley and what has been done on him, a couple of things jump out at me, and this is what I call quid tum, Latin for so what, meaning what next. There's much more to know about LDS art, Latter-day Saint art in the 1830s and 70s. What about the role of photography, especially daguerreotypes? That's an important topic that I know many of you are involved in. There's more to know about the post-Nauvoo years, especially in Milwaukee, where he was named, listed as a painter. What about the folk art or the plain art traditions in that region? Are there things that are out there that we don't know about? And how do we put Maudsley into that art tradition? He's very good and certainly holds his own when we compare him with other folk artists of the time. What about the identification of sitters in Maudsley's works who up to this point have not been properly identified? I think there's more that can be done there. And unknown works that are waiting to be discovered. I think these are some of the bullet points that come to mind regarding where we go next with Sutcliffe Maudsley. His paintings are precious images that really have great historical value. And they're not just valuable from a Latter-day Saint movement historical perspective. It's part of America. It's part of the American tradition of the 1830s to the 1850s or so. And that's why I think the images are important. We need to make him better known. He needs to be known among a very talented artist in that folk art tradition. And I think we have a lot more to do with Maudsley to promote him and make that art known. Again, great historical value, but they're also extremely beautiful images. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to share what I have with Sutcliffe Maudsley.
Fascinating, and thank you, Stephen. We really appreciate your expertise and sharing with us about Sutcliffe Maudsley and really helping us better appreciate the importance of Mormon art in our understanding of Latter-day Saint history. So again, for all our audience members, I would encourage you, if you want to learn more about Maudsley, pick up Stephen's book, From Calico Printer to Portrait Painter, Sutcliffe Maudsley's Nauvoo's Profilist.
And with that, we'll bring our evening to a close. Thank you, Stephen, for joining
Thank
us
you.
tonight and for sharing the fascinating life and legacy of the artist Sutcliffe Maudsley. Your lecture was a good reminder of the importance that art and material culture play in expanding our understanding of the past. We really need to take a serious look at the art and the artists of the past to gain a greater understanding of the historical context in which these early Latter-day Saints lived. So thank you for that wonderful reminder tonight.
Thank you.
And thanks to all of you, our dear friends, who have taken part in this lecture and for your generous support of the Community of Christ Historic Sites. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So I invite you all to tune in next week for our final lecture in this lecture series, The Stories of the Scattered Saints. We're going to welcome our friend Steve Shields and hear about scattered saints of the 20th century in a lecture he calls Divergent Paths of the Community of Christ, the Past 100 Years. So a link was just dropped into the chat where you can register for this lecture happening next Thursday, November 3rd. That can't be right. Let's see, what is next Thursday? Next Thursday is going to be the 17th. Barb, this has gotten me the last 2 times in a row. All right.
Sorry, Seth.
So November 17th at 7 p.m. Central, if you follow that link. So until then, have a wonderful evening. And as Barb Walden would say, keep reading your church history and have a good night. Thanks.